When I first moved into this neighborhood, I was struck by just how perfect everything seemed. Rows of tidy homes with freshly painted exteriors lined the quiet streets. Every lawn looked like it belonged on a postcard, perfectly green, trimmed, and flower beds bursting with carefully coordinated colors. I remember feeling proud, thinking this was exactly the kind of community I wanted for myself and my family. It wasn't long before I noticed how much effort everyone put into maintaining this picture-perfect image. The Homeowners Association (HOA) was strict about everything: lawn height, the shade of paint on your shutters, even how quickly you had to pick up your trash cans after garbage collection. At first, it didn't bother me. I even appreciated the consistency. But it didn't take long to realize that the pressure to keep everything perfect ran deeper than just a neatly trimmed lawn. Behind those beautifully maintained exteriors, there was an unspoken expectation. Don't ever let your struggle show. Don't break from the neighborhood standard, and definitely don't let Karen, the HOA's strictest board member, see you slipping up. At the time, I never imagined I'd be the one to fall short, that soon enough my family's situation would change dramatically. Back then, I was just grateful to have found a nice place to live, unaware that maintaining appearances could quickly turn into a heavy burden, especially when life threw an unexpected curveball my way. Things took a sharp, painful turn the day I lost my job. It came as a complete shock. I went into work expecting a typical day, only to find myself walking out that afternoon with a box full of my belongings. I felt numb driving home, trying to piece together how I'd break the news to my family. When I walked through the door, I saw my kids playing in the living room, and my spouse smiling warmly, unaware of what had just happened. My stomach churned with anxiety. We'd recently taken on a mortgage for this beautiful home, and there were plenty of other expenses from car payments to daycare bills. How could I tell them that the stability we'd worked so hard for had just been pulled out from under us? That night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table and explained what had happened. My spouse took the news better than I expected, reassuring me we'd figure it out together, but the worry in their eyes was unmistakable. Neither of us slept much that night. As the days went on, I spent hours submitting job applications, updating my resume, and reaching out to old colleagues for leads. Every morning felt heavier than the last, and soon our careful budgeting turned into an all-out scramble to keep up with bills. The first thing that slipped through the cracks was our lawn. Previously well-kept and vibrant, it began to grow unevenly, patches of weeds popping up almost overnight. With so much else on my plate, yard maintenance slid further down my priority list. Little did I know someone else had already noticed, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Losing my job hit me harder than I'd ever imagined. At first, I kept a brave face for my family, trying to show confidence that I'd land something new quickly. But as weeks dragged by with no callbacks, no promising interviews, and savings dwindling, the reality began to sink in. Every morning felt like a mountain I didn't have the strength to climb. I'd spend hours scouring job listings, rewriting cover letters, and hoping my phone would ring. Anxiety settled into my chest, heavy and relentless. There were days when even basic chores felt overwhelming, and despite my best efforts, the once pristine appearance of our home gradually started to slip. The lawn was always the last thing on my mind. It wasn't a conscious decision. I was simply exhausted, drained from worrying about how we pay the mortgage and keep groceries in the fridge. While neighbors continued their routine of mowing and trimming, my grass grew a little taller each day, weeds multiplying faster than I could find the time or energy to deal with them. Each time I glanced out the window at my overgrown yard, a pang of guilt washed over me. I knew how much this neighborhood valued appearances, but I had to choose between feeding my family and buying gas for the mower. It seemed like such a simple choice, yet it became one more source of stress, a daily reminder that I was falling short. But what I didn't realize then was that someone else had already noticed, someone determined to uphold the neighborhood's perfect facade at any cost. Karen, the unyielding enforcer of HOA rules, who was about to make my already difficult life even harder. It started on a sunny afternoon, a day that felt normal enough, despite the constant worry at the back of my mind. I was on my way out the door to another job interview when I noticed something taped to my front door. At first, I assumed it was a flyer, maybe an ad for lawn service. But as I took a closer look, my stomach sank. It was an official HOA warning notice, written in bold letters, violation of lawn maintenance standards. The note described in meticulous detail the exact length of my grass, the presence of weeds, and stated plainly that my lawn was negatively impacting the aesthetic and property values of the community. The signature at the bottom of the letter was unmistakable. Karen, HOA compliance officer. Standing there on my porch, letter in hand, a mix of frustration and embarrassment washed over me. It felt like a personal punch to the gut. I was already struggling to keep our family afloat, juggling job searches, bills, and emotional exhaustion. And now this. As I stood there, my phone buzzed, a reminder that I had just 30 minutes to reach my interview. I shoved the letter into my pocket, trying to push Karen's harsh words out of my head. But during the drive, all I could think about was that notice, about how quickly the community I'd once felt proud to belong to had turned on me the moment I couldn't meet their perfect standards. Little did I know, Karen was only getting started. Over the next several days, Karen made it clear that she wasn't going to let this go easily. Notices began showing up on my door regularly, each one more aggressive than the last. Photos of my yard, detailed descriptions of every weed, every overgrown patch, filled each document. Every time I saw another HOA notice, my stomach knotted tighter, my stress spiraling further out of control. One evening, as I was pulling into the driveway after another exhausting day of job hunting, I saw Karen standing on the sidewalk outside my house. Clipboard in hand, she was taking notes, occasionally glancing at my yard and shaking her head. My pulse quickened as I stepped out of the car. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen turned, raising an eyebrow as if surprised I dared to approach. "Just documenting the condition of your property," she said coolly. "As you know, we have very specific standards here. Your lawn is far from acceptable." I tried to explain myself, feeling humiliated yet hoping for a bit of compassion. "Look, Karen," I lost my job recently. Things have been tough. I'm doing my best, and I promise to fix it as soon as—" She raised a hand, cutting me off abruptly. "Rules are rules," she said dismissively. "We can't make exceptions every time someone has a personal issue. It sets a bad precedent." Her words were sharp and unyielding, leaving me speechless and embarrassed. Without another glance, she turned and walked briskly down the sidewalk, leaving me standing there, defeated and angry, wondering how my life had become so complicated so quickly, and how I was supposed to fix it all before things got even worse. Things came to a breaking point one afternoon when I returned home after yet another disappointing job interview. Frustrated and emotionally drained, I stepped out of my car to see yet another HOA envelope taped firmly to my front door. With a deep sense of dread, I ripped it open, bracing myself. Inside was a formal warning notice stating that I had exactly 7 days to resolve the issue of my lawn, or I'd be hit with steep fines. The letter was harsh and clinical, the words coldly indifferent to my circumstances. My heart sank even lower when I noticed Karen's handwritten note at the bottom. "Ignoring HOA guidelines will not be tolerated. Immediate compliance required." I leaned against my front door, feeling utterly defeated. The pressure felt suffocating. I was already struggling to make ends meet, unsure how I was going to cover the mortgage, groceries, or electricity bill next month, let alone a sudden fine from the HOA. I thought of my family inside, unaware of just how desperate things had become, and I felt a wave of shame and helplessness wash over me. In that moment, the full weight of the situation crashed down on me. The job loss had shaken my confidence, but Karen's relentless insistence on perfection was breaking my spirit. For the first time, I wondered if buying this house in such a rigid neighborhood had been a mistake, if the price of belonging here was simply too high. As I stood there, the warning notice crumpled in my hand, I realized that something had to change, and soon. Either I'd find a way out of this mess, or Karen's relentless pursuit of perfection would force my family out of the home we'd worked so hard to make our own. Despite my frustration and exhaustion, I knew I couldn't let this spiral further out of control. I decided to make one last effort to comply, even though it meant swallowing my pride. I borrowed a lawnmower from a neighbor, Mike, who had quietly offered support a few days earlier, and spent the entire weekend tackling the overgrown grass and stubborn weeds. It was hard work, especially under the relentless sun, but I pushed myself, desperate to avoid the fine. Each pass of the mower felt heavy, not just physically, but emotionally, as if I was cutting through layers of stress, humiliation, and frustration. My neighbor Mike came over to help midway through, and without saying much, joined me in trimming and tidying until the yard began looking presentable again. By Sunday evening, the yard finally looked decent. Not perfect, but far better than before. I felt a cautious sense of relief, thinking that this might be enough to satisfy Karen and the HOA. Exhausted yet hopeful, I returned Mike's mower with heartfelt gratitude, believing the ordeal was finally behind me. But when I woke up Monday morning, I felt my heart sink all over again. There on my door was yet another HOA envelope, this time thicker and more ominous than before. Hands trembling, I opened it to find a formal notice that my efforts still fell short of HOA standards. Karen had attached new photos, highlighting every minor imperfection and insisting that I still owed a significant fine for the previous violations. Standing there in disbelief, I realized that Karen wasn't looking for compromise. No matter how hard I tried, it seemed she would always find something to criticize. A wave of anger rose within me, not just at Karen, but at how easily my neighbors and community had turned their backs the moment I couldn't keep up. It was clear to me, then, simply playing by the rules wasn't enough. If I wanted to protect my home and my family, I'd have to find another way to fight back, and quickly. As my frustration grew, I realized I couldn't face this battle entirely alone. The next day, I decided to talk openly with some neighbors, hoping to find allies or at least some guidance. At first, I hesitated, ashamed and unsure, but I knew staying silent wasn't going to solve anything. Surprisingly, many of my neighbors were more supportive than I'd expected. Mike, who had already helped with the lawn, rallied a few others who expressed frustration over Karen's heavy-handed approach. Some shared their own experiences of minor infractions and harsh penalties. It became clear that I wasn't the only person who'd felt unfairly targeted. Yet, despite their sympathy, a few neighbors quietly admitted their fear of speaking up. They worried about attracting Karen's attention, knowing she could easily turn her scrutiny toward them next. Still, even their quiet support gave me strength, reminding me that this was bigger than my overgrown lawn. It was about fairness, compassion, and what kind of neighborhood we wanted to live in. Determined to turn this support into action, Mike suggested we gather evidence of Karen's overly aggressive enforcement. He even offered to help me look into the HOA bylaws to see if she was abusing her authority or misinterpreting the rules. Another neighbor recommended documenting everything: notices, letters, even conversations. Suddenly, it felt like I had a team behind me, a community ready to push back against an authority that had forgotten the importance of empathy and understanding. Though the pressure was still intense, something had shifted. I felt less powerless. The situation was no longer just about me. It had become about reclaiming a sense of community spirit and fairness. For the first time since losing my job, I felt hope beginning to grow again, just like the resilient grass that kept springing back in my yard, no matter how many times it was cut down. Even with the support from my neighbors, Karen wasn't backing down. Just a few days later, I received another HOA notice, this time stating that because my lawn was still not fully compliant, a substantial fine had officially been levied against me. The amount was staggering, especially considering our current financial struggles. My heart sank reading the number. It felt like a punch in the gut. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at bills I already couldn't pay, I felt overwhelmed by desperation. How could we possibly handle this fine on top of everything else? My spouse sat beside me, squeezing my hand gently, quietly assuring me we'd find a way. But I could see the worry in their eyes, too. The unfairness of it all was crushing. The next morning, while I stood on my driveway, still processing the news, Mike came over again. He noticed my defeated expression and asked what happened. When I explained about the fine, his expression darkened. He said firmly, "Enough is enough. Karen can't just bully people like this." Mike promised he'd talk to other neighbors and see if we could rally broader support, perhaps even publicly challenge Karen and the HOA at the next community meeting. The idea made me uneasy, but I knew he was right. Karen's abuse of power had to be confronted. As he walked away, I felt a new wave of anxiety, but also determination. I realized this was no longer just about the fine or my lawn. It was about standing up against injustice, about protecting my family from a situation that was becoming unbearable. Despite feeling exhausted and beaten down, I knew this was the moment to push forward. Karen's ultimatum had forced my hand, but now with my neighbors behind me, I was finally ready to fight back. The turning point came when Mike and a group of neighbors encouraged me to attend the next HOA board meeting. I felt nervous, almost sick, walking into that brightly lit community center where Karen sat front and center, presiding over the board with her usual stern expression. But as I glanced around the room, I saw familiar faces, neighbors who had quietly rallied behind me. Their presence gave me strength. When my turn to speak arrived, I stood up, my voice shaking slightly at first. I explained everything openly: the job loss, the mounting stress, my sincere attempts to comply with HOA rules, and Karen's relentless pressure despite my efforts. As I spoke, I noticed sympathetic nods from around the room. The emotions I'd bottled up, frustration, embarrassment, exhaustion, finally spilled out in a heartfelt plea for understanding and fairness. When I finished speaking, Karen immediately jumped in, referencing bylaws and repeating her usual lines about rules and standards. But this time, the audience wasn't quietly accepting her stance. Mike stood up next, calmly but firmly pointing out the difference between enforcing guidelines and bullying residents who were already struggling. One by one, other neighbors voiced their own stories, expressing frustration over Karen's rigid and selective enforcement of rules. The atmosphere in the room shifted visibly. Even the other board members appeared uneasy, exchanging glances that suggested they were reconsidering the entire situation. Karen, clearly flustered, attempted to regain control, but for once, she couldn't silence the wave of community voices calling for compassion and fairness. The meeting ended without a final decision, but it was clear something had changed dramatically. Walking out of that meeting room, I felt lighter, knowing I was no longer standing alone. For the first time in months, hope began to outweigh the fear. In the days following that emotional HOA meeting, something remarkable happened. Neighbors who had previously been silent or afraid began openly expressing their support. Small gestures started appearing almost daily, a note of encouragement left in my mailbox, someone quietly mowing my lawn without even asking, or a neighbor stopping me on the sidewalk just to say, "Hang in there, we've got your back." Then came an unexpected call. One of the HOA board members, not Karen, but a more reasonable member named Susan, reached out privately. She expressed sincere sympathy for my situation, acknowledging that the enforcement had gone too far and promising the board was reconsidering the fine. Susan revealed that after the meeting, many board members felt uneasy about how things had escalated and were now pushing back against Karen's aggressive tactics. Within a week, I received an official letter from the HOA stating that the fine was being waived entirely. The board agreed to give me time and flexibility to address the lawn situation, considering my circumstances. Although it wasn't a complete reversal of the HOA's strict standards, it felt like an enormous victory and an acknowledgement of my family's struggles. The relief was overwhelming. I stood on my porch, letter in hand, feeling the weight I'd carried for months finally easing. It wasn't just about the fine, though removing that burden helped immensely. It was about feeling heard, understood, and supported by the community I'd chosen as my home. Even Karen became quieter in her scrutiny, perhaps sensing her authority had been checked. Her presence still hovered, stern as ever, but diminished somehow. More importantly, I realized that my neighbors had rediscovered their voices and remembered that community meant supporting one another, especially during tough times. Though my challenges weren't over, a sense of hope returned to our household. The neighborhood felt like home again, and I knew I could face whatever came next, thanks to the quiet strength of the community around me. In the weeks following the HOA's decision, life began to settle back into a more manageable routine. With the immediate pressure lifted, I could finally concentrate fully on my job search, eventually landing a position, one that wasn't perfect, but was stable enough to start rebuilding our lives. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to finally breathe again. Interestingly, Karen seemed to retreat somewhat. She still patrolled the neighborhood with her clipboard in hand, but she avoided eye contact and no longer lingered near my property. Her diminished presence felt like a silent victory, a sign that even she realized her authority had limits. Neighbors continued to check in frequently, offering help and encouragement. The experience had created a deeper sense of connection among many of us. People I had once barely known were now genuine friends. Even Mike joked that the whole ordeal had inadvertently brought our community closer together, teaching us to watch out for each other rather than compete for appearances. One Saturday morning, as I was mowing the lawn, feeling less burdened and more hopeful than I had in months, I saw Karen approaching, clipboard tucked tightly under her arm. For a moment, anxiety tightened my chest again. But as she passed, she paused briefly and without looking directly at me, muttered a quiet, awkward acknowledgement. "The yard looks nice." Before I could even reply, she quickly moved on. The comment was stiff and brief, yet it surprised me nonetheless. Perhaps even Karen had realized the importance of compassion, or at least had begun to question the rigid enforcement of rules that ignored real human struggles. Standing there on my freshly cut lawn, feeling the morning sun on my back, I realized how much had changed. Losing my job had tested me deeply. Karen's relentless fines had nearly broken me, but in the end, the experience had taught me something crucial. Community isn't about perfectly manicured lawns or following every guideline to the letter. It's about standing together, showing compassion, and recognizing that behind every closed door lies a story worth understanding. Life gradually returned to a new normal, a better one, actually. My new job, though not perfect, brought stability back into our household. Bills got paid, groceries filled the fridge again, and the stress lines on our faces slowly began to fade. Yet the most profound change was how connected I now felt to the neighborhood. The bond we'd built through this challenging period was stronger than I'd ever expected. My once simple waves to neighbors turned into conversations on the sidewalk, invitations to backyard barbecues, and an authentic sense of belonging. One sunny afternoon, as I sat on my porch watching my kids playing happily on our now well-maintained lawn, Mike wandered over, carrying a plate of freshly baked cookies his wife had sent over. He sat down beside me, glanced around with a smile, and said, "Funny how all this started over some weeds, huh?" We laughed, but I knew it was true. The ordeal with Karen and the HO had shown all of us what really mattered. The neatly trimmed grass beneath our feet represented more than just conformity. It symbolized a community coming together, willing to defend each other in moments of vulnerability. As I looked down the street, seeing familiar faces smiling back at me, I knew that despite Karen's strict rules, the neighborhood had softened in all the best ways. Compassion had taken root deeper than any weed, reminding us all that even behind a perfect suburban facade, we're all human, and sometimes we just need a little help. For me, it was a lesson learned the hard way, but one I'd carry forever.